Look at this. I got a new toy to play with. Does it sound better now? I also had to change my shirt because I realized I've been wearing the same shirt for the past 3 videos. So, something about recording day, I must just really like my blue striped shirt. I swear I have other shirts. Jeez. Today, I wanted to talk about one of my favorite eras in music history. I have a couple favorite eras in music history, but this is one of the top ones, especially when it comes to piano music. I have a favorite one for choral music, and I have a favorite one for piano music, and this is my favorite era for piano music because I think it's where piano music is just its peak piano music, and that is the Impressionist, not era, but movement at the beginning of the 20th century, coming out from the end of the 19th century. And I wanted to talk about kind of the overview and how it came to be and why it's even called Impressionism, because it's a little bit confusing and there's a lot of, not misinformation, but just like there's a lot of just like things that aren't very well explained, and we just, if you even know of it as Impressionism, it may be confusing as to why it's called Impressionism and all the other labels it's given. And yeah, so I wanted to kind of talk through that today and kind of go into a deep dive into what the basics of it are and all that kind of fun stuff. But the thing with Impressionist music, But the thing with Impressionist music is that in order to properly understand it, we actually have to look at some art history. Because in order to understand the title of Impressionism, it doesn't really make a lot of sense if you don't understand the art movement of Impressionism and how that came to be, and then why that influenced the music Impressionism. So for those of you who may not be aware, Impressionism in art stemmed from the movement of realism, which was a movement that kind of wanted to get away from all the tropes of romanticism in art, which was a lot of very dramatic, very heavy paintings of either historical events or mythological events, you know, scenes from myths and fantasies and things like that. That was Romanticism. Realism kind of came out of that to oppose Romanticism and to emphasize this idea of wanting to paint the everyday life and to paint the things we see around us and not to dwell so much on this fantasy and this kind of unrealistic view of the world around us. They wanted to paint what's in the here and now. And Impressionism is kind of a little bit of a movement to come out of that. Also, you could also think of it as a sub-movement of realism. But Impressionism took that idea from realism, where we want to paint exactly what's in front of us. We want to paint things that accurately depict our environment. And Impressionism took it to the level of, but we're not going to focus so much on the details. Basically, the quintessential painting to describe this is the very first Impressionist painting, which is by Claude Monet, called Impression Sunrise. It's called that because it really does give a good impression of a sun coming up over this, what appears to be this water dock. And you can see the sun coming up in the distance, and it gives you a vague representation of what's going on. There's not a lot of details there. All the lines are very sketchy. There's not a ton of intricate work going on, and it looks more like a rough sketch than it does any kind of actual finished painting. And that was really what Impressionism was all about, was this idea of capturing a moment that we can realistically see about us, but not really trying to give a lot of details as to what's going on, giving that vague impression of a realistic picture but leaving the details to be more of an unstated kind of thing. And of course, this Impressionist movement really came out of Paris and France, which is also where, as we'll find out, the Impressionist music movement also came out of. And there's a good reason as to why that is that we'll get into in just a sec. But this whole movement of Impressionism, it gives this impression of the pictures we're seeing before us, right? So where does the music part of this come into play? Well, Impressionist music is often characterized by a lot of dissonant harmonies, a lot of whole tone melodies, and more of sketches or impressions of a melody than something very clear and defined and precise. Compare, for instance, Debussy's Prélude to the Afternoon of a Faun to Brahms's Hungarian Dance No. 5. Brahms's Hungarian Dance has a very clear melody. We can hear it, we can hum it, we can sing along with it. It's very clear, and it's pretty clear of the entirety of the piece. Debussy's Prélude to the Afternoon of a Faun, on the other hand, has more sketches of a melody and leaves a lot more sections to be vague as to what's going on melody-wise. There's a lot of intricate harmonies, but it more so kind of smooshes and that's a really gross way of saying it. There's a lot more intricate harmonies, but the melody and the harmony kind of smush together, and there's a lot more blurred lines than compared to Brahms's work. So you can see why this music was given the label of Impressionism. It gives the kind of rough sketch or rough outline of a musical piece, especially when compared to the pieces that had been composed prior to this. Now, when I give examples in this video, I'm probably mostly going to use Debussy's work because Debussy was honestly the first Impressionist composer. He really was leading the way out of all of this. And unlike other genres or eras of music, the movement of Impressionism was honestly mostly trailblazed by Debussy. Other people did come afterwards, but nobody did nearly quite the amount of legwork that Debussy did. So because I'm talking about the beginnings, I'm probably going to use a lot of his pieces in reference to giving good examples of what I'm talking about. But with all that being said, Debussy himself didn't really like the term of Impressionism when referring to his music. So why is that? Well, because technically speaking, there is kind of some problems with naming it Impressionism. See, when we're talking about the art movement Impressionism, we're talking about an accurate representation, even if it is only rough sketches of an accurate representation. And when Debussy was writing his songs, he was naming a lot of them in the same way you might name a painting. He's giving a scene, or he's telling the title of a story. The title of his pieces and the title of a lot of other Impressionist composers' pieces gives more of a vague idea of this is what this is supposed to represent. Sort of how you would with a painting. It's no longer just opus this or opus that or sonata this, or it's not just a number, it's an actual descriptive name. So it's clearly supposed to represent something. The problem with that is that it gives, by calling it Impressionism, it's not really accurate to what Impressionism truly is. With Impressionism, you can see accurately what you're trying to depict. But with music, you're never really going to be able to do that. It's more a symbolic kind of representation of the image. So by Debussy naming his piece Prélude to the Afternoon of a Faun, for example, he's titling the piece that this is what it's supposed to represent. But we can't visually and accurately see that. It more is a symbolic representation of the afternoon of a faun rather than a literal representation of an afternoon of a faun, which is where a lot of arguments start as to, is this truly Impressionist music or is this more symbolism? And then we go back to the art movement again, because after Impressionism in art came Symbolism. And Symbolism takes that idea of the rough sketches that Impressionism gave, but takes it to another level and says, but why should we represent it accurately? Let's more represent it symbolically. Let's paint a landscape, and we know that the trees don't look like that. We know that the flowers don't look like that. We know that's not entirely how people look, but it's more meant to act as a symbol for what the overall picture is. Let's truly give a vague impression rather than just saying, oh, it's an impressionist piece. Let's actually go a step further to represent it more symbolically and more abstractly, than still painting a decently accurate picture of what's going on. So thinking of that description of the symbolism art movement, we can see how that's very confusing for why Impressionist music is called Impressionism. Some people argue that it should be titled Symbolist music. Some people still think it deserves the title of Impressionist music. And it really doesn't make a lot of sense either way, because it's music, it's not art, but it got its title from being influenced by art and not music. But people did what they ended up doing. They gave it the title of Impressionism because it reminded them of Impressionist painters, and so the name ended up sticking. The characteristics of Impressionist music kind of represent a little bit of both categories. It gives the sketches and overall structure of a melodic line in the same way that Impressionism does. See, for example, Debussy's, like I said, Prélude to the Afternoon of a Faun, or another one of Debussy's works, The Sunken Cathedral. Both of these pieces have a general sense of a melody, but there's lots of times when that melody can be lost, or it's kind of between the left hand and the right hand, and it's not always clear. It's a very rough sketch, similar to Impressionism. But then the titles, on the other hand, give more of a symbolic picture. But then on the other hand, when we look at the titles of a lot of these pieces, or kind of the backstories as to what inspired the titles of these pieces, a lot of it is much more symbolic. For example, The Sunken Cathedral comes from a British Isles myth about a cathedral being sunken underneath the water. The music represents that in its melodic lines. It's very symbolic. Or in Debussy's The Wind Over the Plains, we hear that wind going across the plains. Like, it's a very symbolic kind of title. So it represents a little bit of both worlds. So now that we have the backstory of it, what does this music sound like? How did it get its characteristics, and what is it really well known for? Well, if you listen to Impressionist music, you'll notice a lot of key things. One of which is that it's very dissonant in its harmonies. This is very different than the stuff that came before it. Anytime you would have dissonance in harmonies prior to this movement, it always resolved somewhere. But Impressionism is the first time we start to get dissonance as just something that exists, something that gives it color, something that gives it interest, something that makes it unique and interesting, and we sit there and we hold that dissonance and it doesn't go anywhere. We don't move to a resolving chord, we just go from dissonance to maybe more dissonance to maybe resolving it eventually, but we'll just stick on this color right now, this color of the music, this timbre, this tone, this quality that it has to it, because it sounds interesting just being these crunchy chords. Parallel shifts are another thing you'll hear a lot. Parallel shifts weren't used too much prior to this. Back all the way in the Baroque era, parallel shifts were a big no-no. They were used more and more as time went on, but Impressionism is the first time we really start to see composers embrace this use of parallel shifts. Take, for example, the big kind of chordal section in The Sunken Cathedral. It's all these big chords just moving one to another, just all stepwise. A lot of times prior to this either wasn't really done or sometimes was considered a big no-no. But now it's like, it's interesting, it's unique. It creates these weird harmonies and these unique colors that we're gonna sit and listen to for a while. We're gonna hold on to it instead of just trying to move on to this pretty resolved chord that we have. And the last big key characteristic is the use of whole tones. Now, whole tone scales are the type of scales that we'll often see used in Eastern Asian music. And in fact, that's kind of what Debussy himself was inspired by. See, I talked about Impressionism and how it started in Paris and how Debussy obviously was French. And this whole idea that it was just this perfect storm of everything coming together. So obviously around the time that Debussy was going through school and was learning a lot about music was kind of when Impressionism was either at its height or had already kind of achieved its height and was sort of moving on to Symbolism, but basically it was really popular and really well known. Debussy kind of grew up in this environment of seeing these beautiful Impressionist paintings and understanding the meaning of that. And also at the same time, Paris itself as a city had been transforming over the past century. It had kind of been revamping itself entirely. And in fact, Napoleon III had had this huge project that had been going on for a very long time where he was just rebuilding all of Paris and making it brand spanking new. So all of these kinds of things were this perfect storm to kind of inspire Debussy, this new art movement, this new look of Paris, bringing all these people in, gave Debussy a lot of inspiration. But one very important detail that also gave Debussy a ton of inspiration was the 1889 Paris World's Fair. Now, the World's Fair were these big, huge events that would be put on in various spots around the world where all these different cultures would come together and just share what they had from their culture. If you've ever been to Disney World in Epcot and been in that kind of around the world section in the back half of the park, that was inspired by these World's Fairs. So that's kind of what it was. It was just these big, huge kind of events where these tents would be put up and people would display their culture and would share it with the rest of the world. And these kind of World's Fairs are where a lot of people started to learn about cultures that weren't their own. It's also where a lot of Eastern Asian cultures got a lot more exposure and how that kind of became popularized in European culture. But that's another topic entirely. In this specific instance with the 1889 World's Fair, Debussy saw a pavilion with Javanese gamelan music. Gamelon is this big, huge kind of sort of like a xylophone type instrument where it's made of all these metal pieces that bring different tones. And these metal sort of little chimes, I'll call them, are hit with different hammers and are played to make music. But it's different than the way we might use a xylophone because it's all of these timbres and colors all played together at once and the music just kind of blurs together. Is this sounding familiar yet? Because Debussy's music from that point on started to become heavily inspired by this type of music. Just this sort of not chaotic, but just this blurring together of these tone qualities and sounds and colors to create an overall effect rather than specific melodic lines. To better understand what I'm talking about, I would highly encourage you to actually look up and listen to Javanese gamelan music. But it is this really beautiful, just mishmash of sound that ends up all blurring together to give you this big overall effect rather than kind of any single note by note melody. And with the gamelan music, whole tone scales are often used. It's not quite traditional whole tone scale like what we would have on a piano because their tuning system's a little bit different, but roughly speaking, it is this kind of whole tone scale where each note in the scale is always a major second apart and there are no minor seconds. And here's where we start to get the final effect of what Impressionist music really is. It's this movement that's inspired by Impressionist paintings and also sort of symbolist paintings. The titles are named more in the way you would name a work of art rather than just a numerical opus number, and they're written with the intent to try to represent something beyond itself. A lot of the characteristics are borrowed from Javanese gamelan music, and those characteristics are often combined with the traditions of European classical music to create something that is truly just entirely different from everything else that came before it. I think a lot of times we take this kind of music for granted. We really don't hear the uniqueness of it because it's become so ingrained into a lot of the more classical music we listen to now. Whether that's music from TVs or movies or music from video games, Impressionist music is still all around us. And so we take it a lot more for granted compared to somebody who was listening to this music for the first time back in its heyday. So if you really want to get a good idea of how different this music really was and what kinds of innovations it was pushing, I would suggest listening to several pieces from big famous romantic composers and then turning around and listening to some Debussy, some Ravel, some Poulenc, any kind of other Impressionist composer, and really listening to that major difference that Impressionism had. I love this stuff too much. I love Impressionist music. It's so beautiful and pretty. And was there anything else I was going to say? Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that too. I've a quick note before I completely go here. To listen to Debussy's version of Javanese gamelan music, because Debussy obviously listened to this music and fell in love with it, that it inspired him to write his own version of Javanese gamelan music. Again, he's not trying to write this gamelan music. He's trying to give more of the impression of this gamelan music. He's trying to represent a symbol of this gamelan music, but he's not trying to copy it or recreate it or say this is gamelan music. He's just kind of going, this was so beautiful and inspiring that I want to kind of create my own version and create an offshoot of that reminds people of what I heard and what I was inspired by. And so to kind of hear Debussy's take on Javanese gamelan music, go listen to his piece Pagodes. I think it's Pagode in French, and maybe the English title is Pagodes, but it's Pagodes, which is supposed to sound somewhat similar to this gamelan music. And then also take that piece and compare it to actual gamelan music, and you can really see a lot of the similarities. It's just this overall, just kind of like a big soundscape almost, instead of having anything stand out in particular. So anyway, yeah, with all that rant done and over with, please go listen to this stuff. It's so beautiful and so inspiring, and I love all of it, every second of it. And then after that, maybe go watch more of my videos. But anyways, with all of that, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I hope you have a fun time going down the rabbit hole of all these Impressionist composers. And of course, if you like this video, feel free to subscribe, because I am finally starting to post videos every single week now. I try to get it up by the weekends, so right now, I think I'm gonna say that I'm basically doing a weekly video. So yeah, I hope I will see you next time. Goodbye. All right. I'm gonna hate coming back to recording this and just watching all the times my hair bumps the mic and go. It's gonna be great. Gonna be fun. All right, you're get out of here. Get out of here. Get out of here. But not really trying to, oh shoot, oh no. Let's see how long we can go. And of course, but also his other works such as La Cathédrale Engloutie, okay, we're gonna do the English title of that. Okay, hold on, I'll be right back. My phone's gonna die. Javanese Gamelon.